Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Mobility Solutions webinar. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation. As we get started, please take a moment to locate the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. During the presentation today, please use the questions box to send in any questions you might have. With that, we will go ahead and turn things over to Amelia Mansfield. Hello.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here today. Welcome everyone to the Mobility Solutions Transit's First and Last Mile webinar. Let's see here. My name is Amelia Mansfield, and I am the Planning and Communications Director at Burton Planning Services. We work closely with tool design to administer the Active Transportation Academy for ODOT. And my roles in the ATA are being a co-manager with Michael Blau from Tool. I also develop courses and I also instruct courses. A little bit of redundancy to what Mike shared, but please stay muted throughout the course of this, and then enter your questions into the chat pod, and feel free to ask questions whenever you think of them. Periodically, Mike will interject with those questions so we can have it be more of a conversation than me droning on for 45 minutes. And then at the end, for the last 15 minutes of the hour, we will do an actual Q&A for any remaining questions that are hanging out there or anything you think of once we cover all of the content. Today's agenda is here on the board for you, just so you get a sense of what we're going to cover. First, I will give you an overview of the Active Transportation Academy so you can get a better understanding of how this webinar fits into the bigger scheme of things. Then we'll talk about why we need bike and pedestrian connections to transit. We'll go on to talking about the demand for connections when it comes to data and other types of information that's available to us. And then we'll move into coming up with different strategies to address the needs and demands in your community for first and last mile connections to transit. And then we'll talk about how we implement those strategies. And again, we'll end with a more formalized Q&A session, but please do ask your questions throughout. So first, we'll talk about the Active Transportation Academy. So this is an offering through ODOT LTAP, where the purpose is to offer training to help communities such as yours to reach your active transportation goals. The ATA has been around for several years. It was initially the Safe Routes to School Academy, and it transformed into something a little bit more comprehensive. So through the ATA, ODOT offers free trainings and workshops to local jurisdictions, anything from local governments, to communities, to schools, public health departments, you name it. We also offer professional development credits for most of our trainings, which is usually an incentive for people to be participating. And then if you want more information, you can always click on this link in the handouts tab of the chat of the GoToWebinar pod. You can take a look at the actual slides in PDF, and those links should be hyperlinked there for your access. So through the ATA, we offer a bunch of different course offerings. So everything from instructor-led trainings, both virtual and in person, to community workshops, also virtual and in person, to e-learning, which is self-guided, or webinars. And then we also have archive material from courses that are no longer as in high of demand, but still relevant. So for the instructor-led trainings, we offer these here. So you'll see a list. I'm not going to read them for you, but the whole idea is that you would have training on how to create some sort of plan or do some sort of planning or needs assessment process, training the trainer, such as in the crossing guard training or the walking school bus training. And then we have our mobility solutions course in here as well. We have some workshops which are more focused and tailored to the community that hosts them, with the idea of having a deliverable at the end. So we have our creating an active transportation plan, our creating a school travel plan, and creating a Vision Zero action plan. And so these don't actually create the plans for you during the 4-hour workshop, but they give you an outline or a step-by-step guide to how you're going to do that in your community. And we find these to be very useful. And then there are e-learnings, which we know in the past year have become more and more common, and we've been converting some of our in-person courses to e-learnings to make them more accessible to you. And then we also have a few courses that are prerequisites to the workshops, so that we make sure that when you come into a workshop that we dive into the details and that you already know the basic information. So our active transportation basics and safe route to school basics are prerequisites for some of those workshops. And then we have others that are available online as well. I mentioned archive material. These are the courses that are available in our archive so that you can still read the materials and access them at your leisure. So you might be wondering, how do you apply to host a training? And so whether this is one of those instructor-led trainings that has more of the general information, or if it's a community workshop, you fill out a form and provide some information about your interests, your availability, who you want to involve, and then an ODOT representative will be in touch with you to hopefully approve your request and get started on organizing it. So we hope that some of you reach out. So now to get into the content of today's webinar. So typically, the Mobility Solutions training is a 4-hour in-person course. It's meant to be more higher level. It isn't a workshop where we're coming up with a deliverable, but it's something that I know is becoming more and more of a consideration in communities. And we know Ohio communities, whether you are rural or suburban or urban, are interested in this. And so that's why we decided to offer this 1-hour webinar today to give you a taste of what this training includes, and hopefully you might be interested in bringing it to your community for the 4-hour full course. So why do we need bicycle and pedestrian connections to transit? So first, we're going to talk about a few definitions that I might reference throughout this webinar today. And so we have things here that you may already be familiar with, but again, for those of you who aren't, a few words here. So fixed route transit is a service that you might think of more traditionally as a city bus. You know where the stops are, you know where it travels to and from, and so that's what fixed route is. Paratransit is a specific type of transit service that meets the needs of people with disabilities, and it follows the ADA requirements. And then demand response is almost kind of like a little bit of both, but the service route and time of day changes based on who's requesting it and when. So first and last mile, what is it? It's kind of a strange term, and I find it can be confusing to some folks, and that's understandable. So the way that we're describing it is it's the leg of a trip that happens before or after getting to public transit or going from public transit to your final destination. And it's also known as the acronym FLM, or first/last mile. It describes the gaps that exist where public transportation is sparse or not available. And so this is why first and last mile became a thing. There was a need expressed in communities by people accessing transit that they weren't able to get to where the transit was, or once they got off of transit, they weren't able to get to their final destination easily. And typically, it's only about a mile or so between where people are coming or going from and where the transit is. So it is a bigger part of a bigger conversation about identifying options in a community for how people get around. It isn't just the fixed route or on-demand services. It's everything to and from and in between. And so there are also options or solutions that are part of that bigger conversation of how do we address this need for the first and last mile, and how people can get to and from where they're going. So these could be infrastructure-based solutions, they could be service or system-based, and they could also be policies. And so we'll talk more about those later on in today's agenda. So first we'll talk about types of solutions. Active transportation infrastructure and amenities is one bucket, and then the other bucket are services. So when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about things like the actual built structure, I guess, for lack of better terms, where people are physically getting to and from transit. And so this could be anything from a sidewalk to a shoulder on the side of the road. It could be a spray painted sign on the ground, such as a sharrow, delineating where a bike should be traveling on a road. And then there are amenities, which aren't the way that people are getting to and from, but they're the items that make it easier for them to do that. So things like benches to sit down and take a break, bike lockers to store their bike before or after they're on transit, water fountains, fix-it stations so they can pump air into their tires, things like that, that really elevate the accessibility and ease of getting to and from transit. So some other things to think about when you're talking about infrastructure and amenities is, the way that your community is designed as well. And so this is, more of a planning type consideration, but thinking about in the areas where transit is serving your community, how are people interacting with that built environment around transit stops or around the places that they're coming or going from? And so things like um, parking for cars behind buildings and the buildings being closer to the street, so it's easier to get into the doctor's office or into the grocery store and not have to walk through a huge parking lot. Looking at providing sidewalks that go directly to the entrances of buildings, things that some of us might take for granted because our communities may already be designed this way, but in other areas, it really can be a barrier to people easily getting to where they're trying to go. So here's an example of um, where the entrances are, but you have all of this parking in between, and that can really be a safety and a physical barrier if you aren't as able-bodied as others, or if there's a lot of traffic and it may just not feel safe. But you can rearrange the site so that the parking is nestled away and all of this pedestrian access is more available. So then moving on to services as a type of solution for first and last mile needs, we have a whole list here, and some of these you may be familiar with and others maybe not so as much. I encourage you to dig deeper into some of these terms after this webinar if you're curious. I'm not going to read these aloud, but you can take a look at everything that's on here, from terms like new mobility, which I will refer to a few times moving forward here, to shared mobility, micro mobility, bike share, scooters, car share. And especially in the past, 14 months or so, a lot of us have experienced curbside management of picking up and dropping off and things like that at businesses. And then we have common abbreviations. These are some things that you may see when you're reading different literature or seeing posts on social media about different services that may be offered in your community or in neighboring areas. I see CAV a lot, which is connected and autonomous vehicles. And at first I was like, what does that stand for? But here's a little cheat sheet for you. So, new modes are constantly emerging, especially these new modes that are related to first and last miles. So, if we think about new mobility being, anything from a fleet of vehicles, it's available to the public, it's on demand, it's technology driven. So it's definitely something that is, in fact, new to most of our communities. Where would we put a flying carpet into these buckets? So that's an interesting thing to think about. Where would it live in this diagram? Is a flying carpet docked or dockless? It's probably dockless. are you splitting the ride with someone or not? I know it depends on how large the carpet is, but if you can think about that as being something really out of the box, you can start to understand how this diagram can be helpful to thinking about this type of service in your community. So for those of you that are looking to get more information on new mobility and want some resources, we have the new mobility task technical report from Walk Bike Ohio, which is one of ODOT's new active transportation related initiatives that's been going on for the past few years. There is information in here for policymakers, for different DOT staff, for MPOs, for local communities, for mobility managers, anyone who's interested in seeing how to integrate new mobility with your Complete Streets initiatives, looking for ways to initiate policy changes that make new mobility easier to implement in your communities. So I encourage you to take a look at that. So we've talked about solutions. It doesn't look like anyone has any questions about that part, so I'll just move on here. So there are a bunch of benefits to first and last mile solutions. So there are also challenges, but we'll talk about the good news first. So if you look at the diagram there on the right, we're looking at the number of people who are killed while walking or while biking, and how that breaks down based on race, and how there is a major disparity there. And so there can be some really big benefits to underserved and minority populations and their communities by providing these first and last mile solutions that are safer, that offer more health benefits with physical activity, less air pollution, things like that. There's definitely an opportunity for added connectivity in your community when people are able to get to where they're going more easily. And there are economic benefits to allowing more people to come into your business districts, to making people be able to get to work more easily. And so I think it's clear that the benefits are wide and varied. There are also wide and varied challenges. So, there's no single solution. I think we see this in a lot of the work that all of us do, being engineers and planners and public health professionals and transit providers, that we can't help every single person. There isn't a one size fits all fix, but there are definitely options, which is helpful. There is expertise that's needed for these, especially for those new mobility solutions, because it's a new field, new information, new technology, new policies. There's a learning curve for people in the community to use different types of first and last mile solutions. Data is a barrier because we don't necessarily always know where people are trying to go to and come from on transit or on walking or biking or using mobility aids. It's just not as robust of a data set as we have for vehicular users. There are some design challenges. How do you integrate bike docks? How do you integrate autonomous vehicles? How do you integrate new sidewalks in areas where you already have limited right-of-way? Things like that. Coordination between different entities that would manage and implement and maintain all of these different solutions is also a barrier. And then people's habits. It's hard to, old habits die hard. It's hard to educate and inform people about what the options are. And then once they know, it's hard to get them to change their habits. Mike, any questions come in?
Hi, not at the moment, but
Nope.
the questions box is open.
Okay. All right. Well, so now that we've talked about those categories of different types of solutions and the challenges and benefits to first and last mile solutions, we could talk a little bit more about how do you figure out in your community where the demand and need is for those types of solutions. So there are key drivers of walking and bicycling and using transit, and I think these are probably all going to be familiar to you, but it's helpful to see them all written out on one page. So, you know, things like in different communities, there are different drivers for people needing to or wanting to walk and bike and get to and from transit. And these are all related to things like culture and physical health and people's income and the safety of the community in general, but also of the built environment, of the sidewalks, of the streets, what have you. The density of the land use, how far away are those um, origins and destinations of people's trips. So if you're in a really dense community, like a downtown or something, of a small community or of a big city, it doesn't matter. The buildings are closer together. People are more likely to hop around from place to place, and it's easier to get to where they're going. But in a more spread out community, the distance between where they're going to and where they're coming from is greater. So, it's harder. Um, is transit even available in a community? That's an issue. And then things like just general amenities, like we talked about before, what's available for people to comfortably and safely get to and from transit. So transit agency resources and capacity is a big uh, it's a need for everyone to understand how the processes and practices of the transit agency that serves your community occur, because that can really help you work with them, or if you are the transit agency, in the case of many of you, then understanding how the funding and staffing and the planning or the lack of planning for how people are getting to and from the transit services is really integral to helping to understand what those gaps and needs are. So using data and different analysis tools can be a really important part of this process and figuring out what those gaps and needs are of your community members. So, where do we get all of this information? So first, we recommend starting directly with your transit agency. And if you are a transit agency, talking to the people that you work with who deal with the data. Um, is this data readily available? Is it something that needs to be collected through a survey or needs to be organized for you to be able to better use it? Um, Also seeing if the data is publicly available. It may not always be, and so that could be where that ends if you are trying to work with a transit agency to get that information. Um, and so, you can also refer to your MPO or your regional transportation planning organization, who has a lot of robust data on where active transportation and transit amenities and services are located. This is often available already mapped for you. I really encourage you to check out your local planning organization to see what kind of data they may already have. Google Maps can be a really great resource, especially now with Street View. You can take a look at things and see what the condition of a sidewalk might be, or what um, changes may have actually occurred over time. You can use a little scroll on there and it can show you changes over time from the aerial photography, and so that might be interesting to see how the built environment may have changed and how that has impacted the need and demand for this first and last mile solution. And then you can also collect your own data through surveys, through going out on the ground and taking a look at what's available, riding on transit yourself and seeing how that feels to get to and from places. Land use is a really important consideration in finding the different gaps and needs in your community. And so I already, referred to this a little bit. I'm a planner, so this is near and dear to my heart, but I won't belabor the point. But taking a look at the land use of a community can be really important, because it affects where people are coming from and where people are going to. So everything from looking at where residential neighborhoods are located, where schools are located, where parks and recreation is, where people are working, where people are shopping. Another resource through Walk Bike Ohio is the demand analysis summary, which gives you information for large regions all throughout Ohio and small communities even, about what the demand is for active transportation amenities. And so you get a sense here on the map on the right. This is Cuyahoga County, and it shows you what the demand is. And in the red areas is where there's a high demand for walking and biking and transit. And then the greenish and yellow are the lower demand. And some of these maps are really surprising. Others are more intuitive about where those needs exist, but I suggest you take a look at those. It can be really informative. So, looking at rural areas versus suburban areas versus urban areas, and then some others that kind of don't fit into any of those, there are different considerations and solutions for first and last mile solutions. So I'm going to go through some of these just so you can get a sense, and hopefully you can identify with some of these and get some inspiration for how you might start to address some of the first and last mile needs in your community. So, as a refresher again from 20 minutes ago, there are a bunch of different types of approaches, and we are lumping them into 3 different categories. So there's policy approaches to first and last mile solutions. There are system-based solutions, which are like programs and different providers. And then there are environment-based, which are the infrastructure and design aspects. So policy, some examples of these would be having transit included in your project prioritization criteria. So if you are a local community and you do your capital improvement program, or if you're an MPO or an RTPO and you're looking at prioritizing funding of projects, making sure that transit is included in those types of decision-making criteria. Adopting a complete streets policy in order to prioritize bicycle and pedestrian facilities. So just the act of adopting a complete streets policy can be beneficial to first and last mile solutions. And also adopting a process to place bus stops near safe crossings. So this is something that transit entities and the local jurisdictions can coordinate on to make sure that when new bus stops are being placed, they are being placed in areas where it is safe and easy for the patrons to access. So service or system-based examples are things like guaranteed ride home programs. I know that transit agencies and some of the planning organizations and other businesses collaborate to offer these vouchers where if someone chooses or has to take transit to get to work or wherever they're going, if they have an emergency that fits a certain criteria, they can get this voucher and use a taxi to get home. So that there's more of an incentive to change the habit or a little bit of a safeguard if you have no other option. And then establishing a bike share program. This is a service and it's also a system. And that takes a bit of coordination, which can be a challenge like we mentioned, but it can also really help to make connections between communities and within communities. And then infrastructure examples, things like building a sidewalk to connect to transit stops. I'm sure, I know I can't see any of you, but show of hands in your private office or home about how many times you've seen a bus stop or a transit stop and there's been no sidewalk to or from it. How are people supposed to get to it? And then connecting trails, so where people run, walk, roll to transit with on-road facilities. So making sure that if someone is on one of those more multi-use paths or things like that, that they can then transition from there to an on-road facility that feels safe and comfortable for them, like a bike lane, so that they can get to the transit stop. So strategies can be implemented in either short or long-term time periods. And so this is really important to think about because when you are planning out what the solutions might be to some of the demands in your community for these first and last mile connections, thinking about funding and low hanging fruit and things like that, the time frame can be really important. So also thinking about how these types of strategies are implemented, and there are a variety of different entities that would be responsible for that. So if you work for a local community and you're coming up with these strategies for transit, you might have to coordinate with the actual transit provider. You might have to coordinate with a private company to build the sidewalk in front of their building or to provide the transit service or the bike share service. You might have to coordinate with residents or grassroots organizations to collect information and to help educate people that this new option is available. So there are a bunch of different ways to engage other um, collaborators, and sometimes that can even help with figuring out what the time frame is for implementation if you can delegate to others or collaborate with others, both for funding and for actually administering the work.
Amelia,
Yeah.
we have a few questions,
Oh,
and
great.
I have copied these into the chat pod for you if you'd like to see them there.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Thank you, everyone, for asking some questions here. All right. We have a question about expanding on the definitions of the new mobility items. I'm going to hold this one until the end when we have a little bit longer to talk about it. I hope that's okay, Eva. Another question here. Are there any studies or recommendations on how to keep first last mile strategies current? For example, when transit stops that were once busy are abandoned or new ones are created. I don't know of any studies off the top of my head, but Mike, if you can make sure this is saved so that we can refer to it after the webinar, we can
Okay.
take a look and provide some in follow-up if that's even an opportunity. Is that a possibility, Mike, to send a follow-up to everyone?
Yeah, we can send an email. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would be great. That way, Eva, we make sure that we get you some pointed resources to look at. For a recommendation for that, though, just coming from my experience with this kind of thing is, well, first of all, making sure that you're revisiting your assessment of the different needs in your community. So it's not just a one-time activity. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, it really needs to be done regularly. And so it can be up to you, based on either the pressure from your community or the availability and staff resources you have available to collect updated information. It could be anywhere from every year to every 4 or 5 years that you're doing new surveys, looking at the actual data itself to see where these first and last mile solutions are needed. So that's one thing to think about, which may address some of these concerns about changes to where the stops are located or how popular they are. Something else to think about is, it may not be the answer you're looking for, but if you're thinking about the first and last mile strategies as more of a comprehensive community service, that if you're offering things like bike share, or if you're building sidewalks, or if you're putting in water fountains or things like that, it isn't necessarily tied to just the bus stop or just the transit service that is current. It can be a long-lasting benefit to the community, and so it may not be as much of an issue to change things once they're already there. But I will get back to you on the rest of that question and think a little bit more about studies and recommendations that might be specific to that question you asked. Okay, is there information on the conditions of the infrastructure for the last mile? And if there is, how could or should this be used to identify maintenance or replacement needs for safety of these assets? Okay, I'm just going to read this again silently to comprehend it. Okay, so the first question I'll answer first. Is there information on the conditions of the infrastructure for the last mile? I think this is definitely dependent on the community that you're looking at, Mark. Some communities or entities, like if we're talking about the transit facilities themselves, like a bus stop, you would be looking at the transit provider to have the information. If you're looking at something like the sidewalk or a bike lane or something like that, then the jurisdiction would have the information. It depends on the type of information that those entities collect. Also, it depends on what MPO or rural transportation planning organization area your community is in, for what level of detail they collect for that information. Sidewalk data, for example, can be really tricky because there are usually a lot of miles of sidewalk in a community, regardless of whether you're rural or urban or suburban. And it's not as easy necessarily to get that information and keep it current. But for information like roadways, a lot of times that information is available via ODOT, especially if it's a major roadway. So it just depends. Ideally, I would say yes, the conditions of that infrastructure, it would be great for it to be available, but it isn't always. If you are a planner or engineer in your community, or you work for one of the entities that is responsible for this type of infrastructure, like a transit agency, I encourage you to talk with your coworkers about how you can make that information be more readily available. For the second question, if there is this information, how could it or should it be used to identify maintenance and replacement needs for safety of these assets? It should be used, absolutely. That's usually a main reason why it is collected in the first place. And it can be assessed by the appropriate person for your entity, like an engineer, for example, to make sure that the condition of it is acceptable, safe. Different things are going to have different types of criteria that dictate whether or not it's safe. Obviously, a sidewalk over a bridge is going to be looked at a little bit more different than a sidewalk just alongside of a road. So hopefully that answers your question. Let's see. Okay, and then just a comment from our friend at ODOT LTAP. I just want to read what she wrote, just because I think it's important. She's just reiterating that it was a great question to ask that about the condition. So she says here, understanding the condition of an amenity or infrastructure can be useful to prioritize not just brand new bike and ped connections, but it's really important when you look at areas where the amenities have a poor condition. And so it might be more important to fix a sidewalk near a highly utilized transit stop than to create a new connection that might have less impact on safety and access. So again, it goes back to that prioritization process within your community. And if you don't already have one, now is a better time than ever just to think about how you prioritize what you work on first. Okay, and then my friend at Tool wanted me to mention a few other resources, but I think we talk about them later on. So Michael, I'm just going to leave those hanging until the Q&A part in case we don't cover them. Okay, let's move on here. Thank you, Mike, for that Q&A break.
Yes.
All right. So as we were talking about before we did the Q&A here, is that the different strategies that you use are going to vary based on the nuances of your community and your land use. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about rural communities. And so we're going to do rural, suburban, urban, and then the ones that are outliers, that are unique communities, and they're going to follow a certain pattern. So when we run through the next few slides, you'll know what to expect for those other community types. So starting with rural, the major considerations are the need for connection to jobs and education and training. I think if you're from a rural community, you know that this is something that's really important to your residents and your businesses and different service providers. Common challenges in rural communities when it comes to first and last mile connections is a lack of sidewalks, a lack of a bike culture, if you will. So people aren't accustomed to riding a bike in more rural areas to get to where they need to go, maybe on paths and parks and whatnot, but not as a utilitarian mode of transit. There's often limited fixed route transit service. So in a rural community, it's less likely that there would be a bus that runs regularly on a route that you know is always set. There's limited transit funding a lot of time in rural communities, which isn't necessarily something that any of us can fix, but it's something to think about in working with your MPO or RTPO and working with your legislators and working with your transit agencies. And there's also a need to connect individuals living in many different locations to many different destinations. So again, talking about land use, when you think about living in a more rural community, whether it's in the town center where you live, you know, on a half-acre lot, or whether it's out in the middle of the country where you live on a 100-acre farm, there's still a lot of distance between where you're coming to or going from. In rural communities, there may not be as many grocery store options. There may not be as many job options. So you may end up traveling farther, even out of your community, to get to where you need to go. And so that's an issue when it comes to these first and last mile solutions, because it may be farther than a mile or two to get to transit services. So you might be wondering, well, what are some ways we can fix this? So in these three different buckets of policy, system service, and environment infrastructure design, we'll give you some ideas. So with policy, adopting a complete streets policy is something that can work for a rural community just as much as it can work for an urban or suburban. And that may be a surprise. I know in trainings that I've done that are in person, so there's more feedback, people from rural communities often say, well, how does a complete streets policy apply to me? And it does, because a complete streets policy is completely context sensitive, which is a term that you may or may not be familiar with, but the solutions or the policy items that are included in it are based specifically on your community. It's not cookie cutter, it's what is going to work for me. And so having a policy can often drive all of these other things to fall into place. Prioritizing improvement of shoulders on the roads where transit connections are needed. So again, with project prioritization, this is something that can be integrated. So looking at providing maps to your residents and businesses that show the most comfortable routes to different destinations. So whether that is on foot or on bike or on transit, making it a little bit easier for people to visualize. And then things like installing signage around your community that talks about where it's comfortable to ride a bike, so bike-friendly signage, where it's appropriate for bikes to be. That way, folks who are riding bikes feel like they're being supported, and people who are driving vehicles understand that bikes belong on the road. And then looking at connecting shared use paths to transit stops, which we talked about earlier, but thinking it's not just about sidewalks and bike lanes, it's also about those amenities that might be a little bit further removed from the road. So a shared use path is something that we're going to dive into a little bit more here. So they're intended for all non-motorized users. So whether you are pushing a stroller, riding a wheelchair, on a bike, on a skateboard, walking, running. A shared use path is appropriate for all of those modes. They are useful where there's a variety of different users, like I was just mentioning, and other safe routes don't exist, like sidewalks or bike lanes. They might link other types of active transportation amenities. They might establish critical linkages. So thinking about if you're just building a 1 mile section of shared use path and it feels like it doesn't really connect to anywhere, it may eventually, and that's important. And then things like rails to trails projects where you're using a former rail corridor that is no longer utilized. You can use this to provide a way for people to get to where they're trying to go, whether it's transit or somewhere else. Some examples. You can see 2 different shared use paths here in Ohio. So the one on the left is along a river corridor and the one on the right is along a roadway. So it doesn't really matter where they're positioned, but where you have the land available, it can be useful. And the one on the right, you see the transit stop there in the background as well. Here's a rendering of a shared use path crossing a roadway, and you could see that there are crosswalk markings and a signal, which is important for the safe interaction of the bicyclists and pedestrians with the motor vehicles. It's also important to note that the shared use path isn't necessarily following the roadway, but it's providing a connection between points of interest. So on one side, we might have a neighborhood, and on this other side, we might have a school and a business district, or a place where people, a factory or something. And so it's meant to be a way to get from point A to point B, and also for recreation. So it's has double benefit there. I see that we only have 15 minutes left, so I'm gonna try to move along a little bit more quickly here, but we have an example of the Perry County Active Transportation Plan. Oh, yep, and so I am going to turn this over to our special guest panelist, who is Lisa Leckrone from, she's a mobility manager in Perry County, and she has been integral to providing first and last mile strategy solutions to her community. And we thought it would be really helpful for you to hear from someone who's done this. And I'm gonna hand it over to her for a few minutes here.
Thank you, Amelia, and thanks goes out to Caitlin, Amelia, and Mike for the invite to be able to speak about what happens here in Southeastern Ohio for us. First of all, I would like to say that mobility was launched in our county in 2016, and our purpose of mobility management is to provide transportation options to individuals, removing transportation barriers so they can access medical, employment, training, recreation, basically any need that they have to travel. Where there is no car, no availability to be able to access getting to where they're going. This can be to meet their daily needs, improve their health, employment to the household, whichever their need is, we want to work with those individuals. Our first and last mile, again, we're a rural community. To give you some understanding of that, Perry County has just over 36,000 residents. Our transit system, we do have of demand response paratransit, which means that we are all ADA compliant and serve those individuals, and we're curb to curb. So we're not on a fixed route, we're not on a loop or anything of that nature. We pull up to the curbside of the destination and pick the person up. We are a rural area of the Appalachian Territory, so therefore with saying that, that gives you a little bit of picture of what we work with out here in our communities. I will add, what works in our communities may not necessarily work in everyone's communities. We know that everybody has unique needs and gaps and strategies and how to approach what our needs are that works in our territory. So encouragement, becoming a mobility manager, we want to be able to have all modes of transportation available. So that included pedestrian walking, and that also included biking. This led to a collaborative effort with multiple agencies that we worked with to be able to get to where we are. First of all, as mobility began, we did not have a county active transportation plan. And through this collaboration effort with the Perry County Health Department, our planning organization with Buckeye Hills, the Active Transportation Academy, working with all those individuals. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, at the time, Kate was still with the Ohio Department of Health and then came over to ODOT. So that was a win-win for us, being able to work with someone that we were familiar with from the health department's aspect, and then moving into mobility as well. So that worked to our advantage here, because we were able to learn a lot within the Active Transportation Academy of providing leadership to what direction we needed to go and how to establish things. Benefits for encouraging walking and biking, the health, the safety, connectivity, getting these people where they needed to be, resulted in a better living conditions all the way around. So again, a win-win situation that we wanted to be a part of. So we shared the same vision with multiple agencies. Health department had their reasons, their plans, their projects. We had what we needed, so we paired up, and it was phenomenal. The community engagement, we wanted to engage as many people as you can. That brought us into meeting tool design, and Michael Blau, who led our meetings, got us, when we would get sidetracked, get us back on track. But it was a good road to go. We learned a lot of things about the communities we weren't aware of. The stakeholders provided a well assessment of what we needed. So one of the items that got us started off, as many transit providers are well aware of, on your application period, you're applying for a period sometimes a year out in advance. We did not include bike racks. We never even thought about having a bike rack in a public transportation vehicle. So under this leadership and this collaboration, we hadn't included in our budget. We weren't going to be able to do that. So health department had some funding, so they purchased bike racks to put onto our transit vehicles so that we had them in Perry County. How could I encourage somebody to ride a bike when we didn't even have a bike rack on a public transit vehicle to get them there? So that came about, and we encouraged those that wanted to bike to be able to bike, not necessarily bike to the transit pickup, but once they arrived in one of our communities or our villages, where would they be going during that? Perhaps maybe they wanted to visit a library and then bike on down to the swimming pool, then be picked up by transit and return back home in the evening. There's all kinds of scenarios that we get into with customer needs and passenger needs, where they want to go and where they need to be. The journey, it's quite a journey to go. As you can see some of the conditions on the video here, this is a Carroll Street corridor project. It is a business, combined a few residential houses in there. But as you can see, you have individuals that are walking in the roadway with families. There is no markings, pedestrian crosswalks, beacons, anything that would be, that I would feel safe in encouraging walking and biking in that area. Another additive to that is this Carroll Street area is where most trips are generated for our public transit. So when we deliver a person into this area, when there's 27 businesses, they couldn't really access from one side of the street to the other side of the street because the lack of the infrastructures. There are no sidewalks there. There was no plan for that many years ago in this area. So this was a project that we felt there was a safety issue, obviously, that led us to wanting to concentrate on this area and make it one of our collaborative efforts under the Active Transportation Plan. So with being able to do that, we were able to work with Michael. We created, Buckeye Hills was able to set us up with funding to get a road safety audit completed with Mott McDonald. And boy, did we discover a lot of items during this road safety audit. You can see that we have individuals on the goat paths. We have commercial traffic in this area. And during the same time, we discovered that we had students, because this area connects to our educational complexes, New Lexington School District on the hill there. We had students using a goat path and walking in the roadway. There are some photos that would prove how terrible the situation is that we face there. But this is an aerial view after working with many public meetings, a lot of information input. This is a view of, idealistically, what we'd love to have is sidewalks on both sides of the corridor, flashing beacons, audio beacons, access areas. But in reality, funding and needs, we were hoping to come up with maybe a sidewalk on the west side, but this leads us to connectivity. When I go back to the students at the school district, they're on the left side of your screen. That is an entrance to the complex, to the schools. So we have children walking goat paths because there are does not exist structures, approved safe structures for them. So along with this active transportation, not only did we have a safety issue here, that led us into safe routes to school, which is another division of what the Active Transportation Academy can offer. So now we've got our communities in both. We're in pursuance of that. We had great leadership, and I would suggest if it's a need for your communities and you could benefit from it, that as a mobility manager, as a transit provider, whatever capacity that you serve in, that we now have a county active transportation plan, and we're in pursuance of what we need to get our people in places for safe accessibility to biking and pedestrians.
Thanks, Lisa. If anyone has questions for her, please put them in the chat pod, and if we have time, she can respond to them, or we can also follow up if it's a more detailed question. But it's definitely inspiring what you've done in Perry County as the mobility manager, and doing this plan as one of your strategies to addressing the first and last mile solutions. So thank you. Okay, so on to suburban communities. For those of you in suburban communities, this is probably no surprise to you, but for others, there is usually a need for connection for commuters to transit within residential areas. There's a need for connections to park and ride facilities specifically. There's also a need for connections to and within office and industrial parks. So even if there is a connection, if transit drops off on a main street, there might be miles that someone needs to travel to get into the middle of that industrial park or into that office area. And so having a way for people to get from the main road transit stop to on the site and where their actual building is needed. Common challenges, again, long distances, like I just mentioned. There's oftentimes a more circuitous street network. So think about cul-de-sacs and dead ends and the winding roads of suburbia, and how that might be a little bit harder to navigate on foot or bike than a more block type of street network. There are oftentimes, especially in older suburbs, not as many streets with sidewalks. Often there may be areas where there isn't street lighting. So for people who, for example, work third shift, it may not feel very safe to be out walking, even if there's a sidewalk, if there's no street lights. And then sometimes there's a limit on fixed route transit service in suburban communities. Different solutions, again, we have our favorite complete streets policy here as an option. For school-aged communities, there's implementing a walking school bus or bike train program. ATA has a training for that. There's also the idea of providing shared use paths, so similar to the rural communities, but also bike lanes to connect to transit stops. If you're a suburban and rural community that are adjacent, that could be a great way to partner. Different type of design strategies. So here with a bike lane, you could, these are ideal for areas with low to medium traffic speeds. Any volume of traffic doesn't seem to make a difference. These are designated, they're designated bike lanes along the side of the road. As you can see here, there's, in this case, a barrier between where the vehicular traffic is traveling and where the cyclist is. That isn't always the case, but ideally there would be. Cyclists travel in the same direction as motorists, so this can also require some education to the bicyclists. And then there are also pavement markings and signs that can be used to let motorists know that bicyclists are there and that they belong there, and to be cautious. Here's a rendering of a bike lane. You can see how the bicyclists are riding adjacent to and in the same direction of the car, and then pedestrians are using the sidewalk nearby. So they're separated. Each mode is separated and able to get to where they need to go. Another strategy is ride sharing. So this is an informal carpool. You have app-based carpooling. You have matched rental car service, you have van pooling. So all of these are things that your local transit agency or your planning organization can usually give you resources or assistance on implementing. So for urban communities, we have considerations about how walkable and dense areas are in residential neighborhoods to downtown, so they tend to all be pretty dense. There are connections needed to schools, jobs, medical providers, different services and recreation. Common challenges are traffic. There's safety issues, whether they're perceived or actual. There are situations there with that. And then oftentimes there's limited right-of-way because most of the land is already built out. So those are things in mind. Again, we have appropriate solutions include a complete streets policy. You could adopt a plan or a process for building sidewalks in your community. This could apply to any of them, rural or suburban or urban, honestly, but tend to be more seen in urban communities. You could implement a bike share program. Tends to be a demand in more urban communities for these. And then different things like sidewalks, sharrows, bike lanes would be appropriate. So I'm gonna scoot past these pretty quickly since we're running out of time here. I think everyone knows what a sidewalk is, but we wanted to provide the slides so that if you want to use these slides later on to pitch these ideas to your communities or your coworkers, you're welcome to do so. Here's a rendering, again, of a sidewalk similar to what we saw with the bike lane image, but here you can see there's no bike lane. Micromobility, I know someone had a question about this. We will we will answer the question at the end of this about defining those a little bit more, but micromobility, in this case, we're talking about a bike share or an e-bike share, and so the difference here is there's a dock, like in this top picture. In the bottom here, it's an e-bike share. Actually, it's an e-scooter where you just use an app on your phone, so there's no dock. Then we have unique areas and users. So this is what I was saying, are the areas that kind of don't fit into any of those urban, rural, suburban. So things like educational institutions and campuses. So think about your technical schools, your colleges, your universities, different employment centers, different types of medical destinations. There are different needs for these unique areas that include the internal circulation, like we were talking about, in bigger industrial and commercial complexes, late night services and amenities for people who are working second and third shifts, common challenges. These unique users and areas aren't tied to a specific community type like suburban or rural, and so there's a no one size fits all solution, but mobility managers and different folks who work in operations and things like that in some of these locations can be really great resources to helping to figure out how to address those needs. So different strategies here. You could update your zoning and development codes to require sidewalks and bike facilities in these types of unique areas when they're built. When these places are built, there could be encouragement of there being a pedestrian-oriented site layout and design. It's like in those first slides that we looked at where it showed the parking in the middle or in the back versus up in the front. And then you could use a walk audit to help you decide how you might want to address these first and last mile solutions. You could have everyone who works at the office complex participate in a walk audit and tell you where they're coming from, what time of day they're doing it, what they prefer. There is a Active Transportation Academy walk audit training as well, if you want to learn how to do those and do one. So another case study, which unfortunately I have already run out of time, but I wasn't able to coordinate with the project manager for this example, but it's unique and it's from Ohio and it's worth mentioning. So the Groveport Rickenbacker Employee Access Transit, or GRATE, is a collaboration between the City of Groveport, the Village of Obetz, and the Central Ohio Transit Authority. And so what they were doing is trying to figure out how to ease the transition for the last mile of people trying to get to their jobs in this industrial area around the Rickenbacker Airport and the associated warehousing and industrial areas. And so they figured out how to coordinate with these two particular fixed route transit lines. They offered a shuttle service for employees to get from the transit into the facility areas. And so that's how they did it. They didn't do necessarily sidewalks or bike lanes or bike share. They did a shuttle service. So how do we implement these? We've talked a lot about project prioritization already. There are some tools and resources out there that we can send out in our follow-up email about project prioritization and how to start doing that. Design is another consideration, which is pretty unique to a community. There are different partnerships and funding opportunities and those considerations. And so with project prioritization, there are a lot of different ways that you could factor in how you're going to do that. Here's a short list of what they might be, the most common ones. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. So like I said, we'll send some resources out to you so that you can potentially borrow from other project prioritization processes. Also take a look at your planning organizations or your community's plans and see if they already have a process in place that you could adapt to your own needs for the first and last mile strategies. For project design, there are resources available through different national and state and local sources. So NACTO has these Transit Street Design Guide and the Urban Street Design Guide, which are free online and great to take a look at. You can also buy hard copies. There is ODOT has some great resources as well for project design, and such as the Multimodal Design Guide, which is going to address transit issues. And then your local transit provider, or if you are a transit provider, you might have design guidelines for your transit stops and whatnot. Your different project partners, we've talked a lot about these already, so they're just here for you to refer to, but thinking about everyone who might engage with transit and where you're going to and coming from and in between are potential partners for figuring out where to do the last mile strategies, but also in how to fund and implement them. So here are a bunch of different resources that you can click on in the PDF in the handouts drop down. There are some really great ones in here that you can just pull from and use. And I can't give any of them enough time in even an hour for each probably. So you'll have to check them out and let us know if you have more questions on them. Here are some additional ones. Again, they're listed here so that you can click on them and peruse at your leisure. I also was remiss to mention that there are some other ODOT resources that are really great for finding data on existing conditions and figuring out what kind of gaps there might be for first and last mile connections. And those are, one in particular is, if you Google ODOT TIMS, you will find an interactive map that is really robust, and you will be surprised at the level of detail available on there. But there are things like where ADA curb ramps are located, where there are crosswalks, where there might be bike lanes, multi-use paths. So take a look there and see what ODOT may have already collected. And then the ODOT Active Transportation Plan Development Guide, which is going to be coming out, will have guidance on creating inventories for active transportation facilities. So keep an eye out, sign up for ODOT e-newsletters so that you get a notification when that is published so that you can refer to it. So thank you everyone for spending 10 more minutes than we had scheduled. there are still 43 people on here, so I will take that as a note that people are interested in asking a few more questions. But first, I'm going to hand it over to Michael Blau, who is my co-manager of the Active Transportation Academy, so that he can answer the question about further defining the micromobility terms. Mike, are you able to allow Michael to have the mic?
Let's see.
It's a lot of mic words in one sentence.
Michael, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I'd be happy to elaborate a little bit on the terminology that Amelia mentioned earlier. Essentially, there's a lot of overlap in these terms, and some of them mean the same thing. So for example, new mobility and emerging mobility are often interchangeable, and that's capturing sort of the broader umbrella of ride hailing, car share, bike share. We can also throw in autonomous vehicles, micro transit. So a lot of these new forms of mobility and travel that are appearing in different communities. When we go more specifically into things like shared mobility or shared micromobility, shared is the key term there. So we're really talking about, bike share, e-scooter, again, car share, types of programs that offer a service in terms of allowing you to use their vehicles, whether it's scooters or bikes or whatever the case is. And Amelia showed some examples of that. So we have a bunch in Ohio. For example, she showed a picture of the Link bike share in Dayton. That would be an example of a docked bike share system. We also have Lime in places like Columbus and Cleveland, which is an undocked system, meaning that you can park those vehicles anywhere. Of course, with each of these different programs and setups come different types of questions, such as accessibility for different community members. Sometimes there are equity issues when you have an undocked system and all of the scooters or the bikes wind up in a fairly affluent location or a popular location like downtown, and they're less accessible to other parts of the community. So all of these programs and platforms have their pros and cons, and it's important for people to consider that before they adopt any of them. Amelia, is there anything else that I should cover? I know we're a little short on time, so I want to keep it brief.
No, I think that you did that service, and if the person who asked that question has any more questions on that, you are always welcome to follow up with us directly. And I'm sorry for scrolling through these and giving anyone a headache, but it's the only way that I can do this right now. So I'll go back to our contact information. And if you want more details, please email me directly at amansfield@burtonplanning.com, and Michael and I will collaborate to respond to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Amelia, Lisa, and Michael. And thanks everybody for your participation today.
Yeah, thank you so much.